Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Election Day in Canada is just around the corner, April 28th, 2025, and we recorded this episode on April 9th. As we head to the polls, a lot of important questions are on Canadians' minds. Should we stick with the current government or take a new direction? Who's best equipped to lead the country? What kind of relationship will the next government have with the U.S. administration? How should we respond to the latest policies coming out of Washington? And perhaps the most personal question of all, am I voting for my local candidate or the party leader? To help us unpack these questions, we're joined by Dr. Kathy Brock, Professor Emerita from Queen's University's School of Policy Studies and the Department of Political Studies. With decades of experience in Canadian public policy and administration, Dr. Brock brings a wealth of knowledge to this non-partisan conversation. As many have said, this is a pivotal election. Our goal with this episode is to give you some thoughtful context as you prepare to cast your vote. Just a reminder, this conversation was recorded about 3 weeks before Election Day. Kathy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Dave.
We want to remind our listeners that we are recording this podcast in the middle of the Canadian federal election campaign. And for those of you interested, the election day is April 28th, 2025. Now, there's a lot you and I might want to chat about today, and I know we won't cover everything we might want to, but let's start with this. Almost, according to what I've read, 63% of eligible voters cast a ballot in the last federal election in 2021. Was that a good number?
That is not a bad number. If you look at the provincial election, it was much lower. The recent Ontario provincial election and often municipal elections are even lower. However, it's not a robust number. It's not a number that says Canadians really care about democracy. Mm-hmm. And democracy is something we should not really take for granted. We should actually actively vote if we believe in it.
What kind of rate of election participation do you see this time around? Can you predict, or would you predict?
I'm not inclined to do predictions. However, what I've seen is that the turnout looks like it's going to be a bit lower.
Really?
And that would be disappointing, especially when there are so many big issues on the table for Canadians right now.
Now, let's talk a little bit about your career and how you got to this particular point. So you are a teacher, you are a writer, and you are a researcher, and you focused most of your career on public policy and administration here in Canada. How did that particular passion develop?
Well, it was interesting because originally I was going to go into the law, and I loved the law, I loved the Constitution, and it was by happenstance that I ended up where I am. One of my professors in my fourth year said, why don't you just try graduate work and see what you think? And so I thought, okay, it's just a year, I'll do that. And then I went back to him for a reference and he said, why don't you just try the PhD? And so I thought, well, I can do a combination of political theory and Canadian government. But as it turns out, trying to get professors from those two areas to cooperate did not work out. And after my first year in the PhD, they said, why don't you choose either theory or Canadian government? And I thought, well, Canadian government is a little more practical, so maybe I'll go that route and keep theory on the side. And as it turns out, it was a really good choice.
Now, do you have a preference in terms of the things that you do? Do you enjoy writing better or teaching or researching?
As a professor, one of the wonderful things is that you can do teaching in the classroom, which I love. And I do have 2 teaching awards, which I consider among my highest accomplishments to get those, one national and one at Queen's. And so the teaching is important, but I also have a passion for research. And I love writing. I don't necessarily like the process sometimes because you have to go into another world and don another hat, and you don't really surface until you finish a project. So I'm currently working on a book, and I know I'm going to go back into the revisions, and that'll be my focus for the next 2.5 months. So that's a little tougher. But when you look at research and teaching, they're both the same function. They're conveying ideas, discussing ideas with different groups of people. And so I love them. And then when you're a professor, one of the advantages is that you can actually apply your ideas through advising governments, working with governments on projects, which is why I've gotten so involved with First Nations, provincial and federal governments, and parties of all different stripes, because you actually test your ideas, and that's important, I think.
How do you relate the ideas that you develop in your office amongst the students that you teach and take those ideas and go out to governments or go out to different groups around the country?
Well, this will make you laugh perhaps, but it is in part because of the very beginning of my career. When I was fresh out of the PhD, I hadn't finished my dissertation, and I was told to get on the job market because nobody would look at me for a year, but I'd get my name out there. And I ended up getting a job, a tenure track job, which was really unusual. So I went to the University of Manitoba, and because I was focusing on the Constitution, federalism, Canadian government compared to Australia and the United States, and on Aboriginal issues, I was asked to be research director for the Manitoba Task Force on Meech Lake. And at that time, I was in my office and I was working away advising the task force when we met and going to all of the hearings on the Meech Lake Accord and how it was affecting the province. And there came a point when I received a phone call and it said that the federal government was no longer going to ever meet with the Manitoba government till it changed its position on Meech Lake. And I thought, wait a minute, that's not how federalism is supposed to work. Our governments are supposed to work together. And I thought, that is not what the textbook said. And that moment always stuck with me because then I realized how important it was to test your ideas and then to look at what the real world is really doing and ground your ideas in that. Plus, part of the reason why I do like taking the ideas out is I believe in community, strengthening community, and giving back. And I'm in such a privileged position as a professor that I should be doing that.
For many of us, listening to a particular song or watching a film or visiting a location will trigger some sort of personal memory. And I've read that you've noticed something similar to that with some of the topics that you've been doing research on.
I have actually. The book that I'm currently finishing is called Assessing Canadian Federalism, Then and Now. And it looks at the Canadian governments, how well they operate together. But what really triggered it was throughout my career, I had marvelous opportunities to observe the governments up close, to advise them, to be working with them, right from being research director for the Manitoba Task Force in Meech Lake, to advising the Manitoba chiefs, to advising the federal government, getting involved with the political parties. So this book on federalism actually looks at all the ways that my life was intertwined with the Constitution and some of the constitutional developments. I'll give you an example. When I introduced the chapter on the constitutional talks, I include a little anecdote at the very beginning, and it's a very short one, where I was at a constitutional conference during Charlottetown, and one of the senior authors and academics from Quebec walked over to me, he put his arm around me, and he said, "Kathy, what you have to understand is that for most of Canada, constitutional negotiations are about the head. But in Quebec, it's about our heart." And once you understand that, you can understand the divides between Quebec and the rest of the country, and it also applies to Indigenous peoples as well. So those incidents just confirmed to me that I was on the right path, and that's why I should focus on Canadian government, federalism, Indigenous issues.
Let's talk a little bit about the changes that have come about with respect to how we learn about issues or find more information about the issues we should be knowing something about. And my question is, are we getting enough information on the important issues so that we can make an informed decision when we go into the voter's booth?
The biggest change, as we all know, is social media. And people are tending to follow sites where they get fed the information that fits with their own perspectives. I think one of the most important things as a citizen in a democracy is to look at various sites. So if you tend to know that you have one position, or if you tend towards a certain position, then go to a site that really disagrees with you and get the information from that perspective and think about it. Why do they disagree? What is important about this? And where is their common ground? Try to find that. So when I'm looking at an election or when I'm doing election commentary, one of the things I will do is go to the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the National Post, CBC, CTV, any sources I can on the media, as well as my own news feeds, just to get different perspectives. And then, if it's an election, go to the party platforms, go to the original sources. And I'll give you 2 examples of why that's important. On April 2nd, President Trump came out with tariffs, his announcement on tariffs. And when I looked at the media that day, one of the things I noticed was that they were saying Ontario was going to be, the Canadian sources were saying Ontario was going to be very hard hit, and this was going to be devastating, including for the auto sector. And I thought, now this is odd. So I went to the American sources, got a very similar commentary from CNN, but when I turned on Fox News, they were interviewing a prominent Canadian who said, well, actually, if we look at the agreement, it's going to have a very different impact because there are mitigating factors for the auto industry and the tariffs are going to be lower. And the person said, who's responsible for this? Premier Ford of Ontario, because he managed to get Ontario's position across to Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce in the Trump government. So that told me, okay, there's more of a story here. And so then I actually went to the media reports from the governments themselves on how the tariffs were going to affect them. So that's one example why it's important to go to various sources and then an original source if you can. Another example would be 2 days ago, former Prime Minister Harper introduced the leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, at a rally. And when I saw the headlines in the paper, they said that the former Prime Minister said that Trump was not having an effect on the election. And I thought, now this is odd for him to be saying that. Someone who understands politics and knows that there is an effect. So when I went back and looked at the actual words, he had said, it's not going to be an election about Trump merely, it's about more than that. And he used the word merely, which means he understood that there are many factors, but he also placed the blame on how Canada was prepared. So that's why you have to go to different sources and find out what was really said. And I think an astute voter would want to do that.
Do you think in the past that voters in general would have done that much analysis going from one source to another source?
An astute voter. But the reality is most of us don't have enough time. I'm in the luxurious position of this being part of my job, so I can do it. But sometimes it only takes you 5 minutes to check a story. And you can't look at every story. You just have to look at key ones.
And you have to find what you perceive to be an accurate source of information.
That's
which is
right.
a whole other issue.
And then always check it.
Yep. Let's talk about a couple of the issues, in particular, federal elections. So if we go back, say, almost 60 years, and we start with Pierre the father, and we work our way to Justin the son, the simple view among a lot of people is that a political party is in power for 8 to 10 years, and then we throw them out and bring in the opposition for the next term. Is that a fair assessment, or is that just something that appears to be what it is?
One of the things that I tell my students is that the voter en masse is always right. And so you have to live with the decision of the voters, even if you don't personally like it. Mm. And one of the tendencies we've seen with Canadian voters is they have a tendency to vote people in, but then to the 8 to 10 year mark, they really start to say, well, maybe it's time for a change. And generally there's some wisdom in that because a party can get tired. The ideas start to run dry. Plus, there are some people who get a little too comfortable with ties that are a bit too strong to the government. And so if you do have a change in government, it's very healthy. Now, one of the recommendations is that we should adopt an amendment like the United States did after President FDR, saying that the Prime Minister should only be able to serve for 10 terms. But again, that's where I return to my original principle, and I would say, no, the voter's always right. Generally, you want to change after 8 to 10 years, but sometimes stability is the answer, and the people will let the government know when that occurs.
So you're not a big fan of term limits?
But Canada has term limits, in a sense, because every 5 years, we've got to go to the people and get a renewed mandate. Mm-hmm. But it's term limits as defined by the voter, not one that's defined on paper that might not fit circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Arbitrary. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing that voters struggle with, and I'll put myself in that boat as well, is the business of going into the booth and saying, am I casting my ballot for the local candidate who is running in this particular riding, or am I casting my ballot because I like this leader of the party over the other leader?
In Canada, the way our system is set up, look at your local candidate. The person who becomes Prime Minister is going to be the person who has the strongest representation returned by the voters in each individual constituency. To me, that's really important, and it's something to keep in mind when you're actually voting itself. There's a certain complexity to choosing a leader, and often we don't have all the information to decide who actually is going to be the best leader of the country. So, for example, with Mark Carney, people are saying, well, he's the best leader because he was governor of two national banks. He knows finance and economics. And yes, he does. Those are his strengths. But he doesn't have the breadth of understanding of political issues that a politician would need. Similarly, if you look at Mr. Poilievre, he is a career politician, so that gives him knowledge of the issues, so he's going to be able to hit the ground running if he becomes Prime Minister, and it gives him a breadth of understanding, but he doesn't have the applied knowledge where he's been out in business or in another profession. So each of them, then, if you're going to look at them, you have to say, well, what kind of advisors are they going to have around them? And what kind of advice are they going to be getting? And that's something we can't really know about either of them. The other caution I use when I'm thinking about whether or not people should look at the leader or their local constituent, or the person running in their local constituency, is if you look at Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he had an academic background. Stephen Harper was an economist with nonprofit background. If you look at Jean Chrétien, he was a career politician. All of those individuals were very strong prime ministers. And so to assess the qualifications of the job is very hard. Now, if you look at your local candidate, most people have an idea of what issues are important in their daily lives and what is key for them and what they would like to see for their local community. And that is something that they can really look at their local candidate for. Are you going to be a good voice when you go to Ottawa? Can you represent us and see that our views are heard? Sometimes that's hard to see, because if you elect someone to a party, when they go into caucus, we don't have eyes into the caucus to hear what they're saying, but we can judge by whether or not they deliver results. So an example would be Peter Milliken, when he was the candidate for Kingston and the Islands, and he was elected multiple times. He became Speaker of the House of Commons, the longest-serving Speaker, I believe. And people criticized him because they said, well, he didn't really come out as a firebrand when he was on the campaign trail. But when I spoke to two prime ministers and I asked about Peter Milliken, they said, hey, no one's going to turn down the Speaker of the House of Commons when he asks for something for his constituency, but you also have to mind the lines of propriety, and you can only go so far as well. They said, that's one of the toughest asks, but you never ignore them. And now that's something the voter couldn't see, except for with the results that Peter Milliken could bring to the local riding. So when you're voting, I always tell my students, I tell Canadians or Kingstonians when I'm doing media interviews, look at your local candidate. Is this the person who's going to give you a strong vote and a voice and argue for you in caucus? If so, vote for him or her or them.
For those folks who are listening from outside the country, Mark Carney is the recently elected leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. And in Canada, typically we have had either a Liberal government or a Conservative government. And I know that there are people, and I'm going to ask you this question based upon research you may have done, is that they will say, I will vote Conservative till the day I die. It doesn't matter who's running locally. It doesn't matter who the leader is or who the people in cabinet are. I just vote Conservative or I vote Liberal. How prevalent is that, or is it still a thing?
We have really moved away from that in Canada, and people now are more likely to change their vote. There'll be a core vote for every party, including the NDP party and the New Democratic Party in Canada, and also the Bloc Québécois. But there's a certain fluidity in the middle that is greater than it was in the past. And we saw that most strikingly in the 1993 election, when the Conservative government went to the polls and the Liberals were elected to take over from the Conservatives, and the Conservatives went down to 2 seats, and people could not believe it. Mm-hmm. I remember one friend was flying back to Europe, and he was an advisor to the Conservative Party, and he said, we got over the Atlantic provinces, and I said, so how are we doing in the election? Because the results were starting to roll in. And one of the stewards said, well, your party has 2 seats. And he said, no, I know in Atlantic Canada, that's what we would expect. How about the rest of the country? And they said, no, 2 seats in the whole country. So people are a little more fluid now, and especially the new generation coming up.
You've already talked a little bit about the way that we are reacting to the election of Donald Trump for a second term. My question here is, we've been subject to a lot of news coverage over what he has done in his short time, the second time around. Do you have any sense as to how the Canadian government, regardless of who gets elected at the end of this month, be reacting to dealing with a government in Washington that is far different from what we're used to? At least that's my impression anyway.
One of the things that Canada has to do is to realize that just as the Prime Minister is only one person, with one voice within the institutional structures. The president is one person, albeit with a very powerful voice within the institutional structures. But Canada has always been most effective when we've had delegations going down to the United States that are armed with facts on how decisions will affect both Canada and the United States, and they lobby Congress, they lobby the State Department, and they lobby anyone in the current administration. So that is one thing that's going to be very important. And to return to your question about looking at the local candidate versus the national leader, regardless of who comes into power, whichever party, and this goes for any of our parties actually, Canada is different than the United States in that we have a very powerful, very responsible public sector that is permanent, merit-based, not replaced by parties. And a lot of people around the world have different systems than this, but we don't replace our public servants when the government changes. Some positions might change, some people might choose to leave, but generally you get the public service there. So regardless of who comes into the office of Prime Minister, they're going to be listening to our public service, and they're going to be getting advice. Now, it'll be shaded slightly different, but the core messaging will be similar for the different parties. And that makes a difference in when you're assessing candidates as well, knowing that we're in good hands and the Prime Minister is going to receive good advice internally in handling the United States. That's why I'm less concerned than some of my friends about the outcome of the election.
Does it make a difference when a president in the United States has control of the Senate and the House of Representatives in addition to the executive branch?
It influences the balance of power towards the president. However, in Canada and in the United States, our systems are so different, but the checks and balances on power in both systems are very different, but very powerful. So even with President Trump, he's a very strong actor, very committed, but he can't always count on the Republicans voting with him in Congress. Even if he does have a majority of Republicans in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, sometimes people will defect that it works on trading votes back and forth on issues. So he can't necessarily count on that. Similarly in Canada, there are always checks on our Prime Minister. I once had Prime Minister Mulroney come into, 2 years I had Prime Minister Mulroney come into my Canadian government class. And I asked him if the power of the Prime Minister or President is unlimited, as people are led to believe. And he said during his time in office, there was only one issue on which he got his own way 100%. And he said that can only happen if the Prime Minister believes in it, his clerk believes in it, his advisors believe in it, the House of Commons believes in it, the Senate, the public, the courts, the media. And that's certainly what President Trump is finding right now with some of his measures that some people feel have gone too far. The people are on the street, the courts are reacting, Congress is reacting, other countries around the world are reacting. And that means sometimes you have to walk things back, and sometimes you need to rethink what you're doing.
One of the areas that I think you've done some work on, and that's the relationship between the federal government and the provincial governments. And I'm wondering if the relationship between those entities has changed or evolved over the last several years.
It really has. And this is in part because of the different approaches of the Liberal Party and also the Conservative Party when they're in power. And you referred to this earlier in that these tend to be our two parties that are returned to office in Ottawa, or they're the ones that have been returned historically. The Liberals, because they believe in a strong government and a very powerful social security net around Canadians, they tend to be more comfortable with a stronger federal government and the federal government taking the lead and the provinces working within their areas of jurisdiction, but listening to national objectives, goals, or issues, and often putting money into it so they can persuade the provinces to follow them. In contrast, the Conservatives are more likely to adopt a position that we have a federal system. Our governments are sovereign equals, and that means that the federal government should not invade provincial jurisdiction, just as the provinces should respect federal jurisdiction, and they should work together to come up with answers. So the two parties then view federalism a little differently, one with an emphasis on a strong federal government, which is ironic because that's the Liberal Party, and they're hearkening back to the vision of people like George Brown and Sir John A. Macdonald. And the Conservatives are saying, no, we've got two equal levels of government, which is hearkening back to the Liberals like Oliver Mowat and some of the other founders. But these two visions are important. It's important to have differences across Canada and to hear when our premiers disagree with the federal government. I think it's nice that we've got a really strong dialogue going among Doug Ford, Danielle Smith, Premier Eby from BC. They're chiming in. This has the effect of holding our government to account, our federal government to account, and saying, you have to listen to other voices, and as a result, we come up with better policies because of that. The other advantage is that when we have policy mistakes that happen, no matter how well-intended our governments are, if we have a strong federal system, even if it's balanced one way or the other, as the two parties like, if we do have the different decisions in jurisdictions, then ones that work can be borrowed, but ones that fail are only confined to that jurisdiction. So there are real advantages to respecting federalism, although sometimes it can create a sense of arguing between governments, a cacophony of voices, but it's actually often because we have that messiness that we come up with better policies that have guided Canada so well.
One of the issues that we have heard a lot more about since talk of tariffs that Washington is wanting and has imposed is the issue of interprovincial trade barriers. And I haven't given that much thought, sitting around watching the news items that come up on TV once in a while. There's talk that if we were to solve those issues, those barriers, or eliminate the barriers, that we would be much better off economically. And I don't know how true that is.
Well, that would be very true and very much liked by Ontario and probably Quebec. But it would not work that well for the Atlantic provinces, and it might have negative effects even on the Western provinces. When we go back to our original Confederation, one of the biggest fears of the Atlantic provinces, and the reason why all four provinces or colonies did not join and become provinces at that time, was because they said Ontario and Quebec are so powerful economically compared to us, they're going to drain us dry. And some of that happened. So, for example, we still have the Bank of Nova Scotia. What happened to the Bank of New Brunswick? It went under when it faced Ontario's banks. Or if you look at the West, they also have serious economic concerns and often feel that their voice is not heard because although their numbers are going up in terms of population, they often don't have representation in Ottawa that's strong enough to outcount Ontario and Quebec. So that creates some problems for Canada. Now, when it comes to the interprovincial trade barriers, sometimes the provinces need that in order to protect their health and their economy and their local production. We do need to lower them. That's fairly clear. One of the obstacles is going to be the Supreme Court case in the beer decision, when someone was charged for transporting beer from Quebec into one of the Atlantic provinces, and everyone thought that the Supreme Court was going to strike down interprovincial trade barriers. It did not. It's not as easy as it seems. Back in 1993-94, I was included on as an observer on discussions then to bring down interprovincial trade barriers. They didn't make it.
That sort of leads into my next question, which revolves around a conversation I had with one of your colleagues, Paul Gardner. And he and I were talking about his theory that a lot of new law is being created in the states by court cases, people challenging somebody in court, as opposed to legislators coming up with law where we think it should come up with. Do you see that sort of thing happening here?
The short answer to that would be you're going to have to read my latest book to find out. but I'll give you a little insight into that from my perspective. Canadian courts have always been more deferential than the American courts. And even the current court, the current Chief Justice, have said, we always have to remember the courts and the executive, so the courts as well as the Prime Minister and the public sector, are subservient to Parliament. Democracy is the rule of the day in Canada, and so we always have to bow to Parliament when it's important. Now, they say that, and occasionally they do give Parliament a little shove to improve laws or to change them. So we haven't gone the American route, and I would argue also our appointments to our courts have been very good, very responsible, generally speaking, and so the judges do tend to watch that line and not cross it as much as they do in the United States. In the U.S., the courts have to really watch that they don't lose legitimacy if they become too political. In Canada, our courts do seem to be more mindful of that, and our judges do prod the governments, yes, sometimes challenge them, but generally they also talk about judicial restraint and the need for government to take action that they will then review and tell the government if it got it right or wrong.
One of the issues that occupies a lot of time these days in conversations I have with other people, and I'm not talking about professors. The question is, we have so much news coverage about one man in the last 90 days. And it seems to be if he speaks, it's covered in the news. And I'm wondering how the general citizen should react, like on this side of the border, to what's been going on in the States, because there is a school of thought that basically a lot of what is happening in the States has been detrimental to their way of governing. And it's going to have some impact at some particular point on this side of the border. And I guess it's people worrying about where this is all going. Do you have a sense of that in your conversations with people?
I do. I hear about that, particularly after a curling match when we're all sitting around having a social hour. And I hear that my colleagues, my friends, are nervous about that. And two things strike me. The very fact that we are debating this and that we're worried about this affecting our institutions shows how powerful Canadian democracy is. Yes, we should keep up and we should be vigilant and remind our governments of this. So I think that's one thing that's very important. But it's just important that Canadians realize that potential. The second thing is we have a different institutional structure. And Canadian institutions do have checks that are much more subtle. And so they will help us resist some of that influence. So that's another protection that we have. And then just on a personal element, and when I'm talking to people, one of the things we know, and I've read a number of books on President Trump and his style of negotiation, he's a lot about high rhetoric, but then what he delivers on is very focused, targeted, and the impact is not as bad as it's even being said in the United States. And just to back that up, when he first came into office, I was doing a project, one that compared the election styles of President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau. And I went down and I talked to people within the State Department. And I said, how bad is he for your country? And, do you find that your job is just getting very frustrating? And each person that I spoke to said, actually, no. On key issues, he has a tremendous impact, and those issues have to be handled. But most issues go on as they would normally. And one person showed me a document that had gone up to the president for the president's approval. I couldn't see what was in the document. He didn't violate confidentiality there. But what I could see is the only comment that the president had written on the document was, great work. And that was it, because it wasn't an issue he was concerned with. So Canadians have to filter out a little bit of the rhetoric and the hype that's going on and trust in our institutions.
The ideas that he is promoting right now, talking about President Trump, are they his or are they those around him who are influencing the direction that he's taking the country?
Probably both. This is a person who had 4 years out of office to sit there and to think about everything he didn't do, that he wanted to do, and why he was obstructed. So yes, he is a little more powerful this time, and for some people that would mean a little more dangerous too. So this one's reasons why it's good Canadians are vigilant about this when we look at what's happening in the States. But he's also someone who values the company of intelligent people and listens to advice from others on key issues, but then he makes the decisions and accepts responsibility for them. So I think it's a combination of the two from what we can see and from what I've more read on him than I know personally.
I'm going to wrap up by going back to the beginning, and that's a line that you often hear among people that we talk to from day to day, and that's, I'm not going to bother to vote this time around or any time because my vote doesn't count. I'm one person. What do you say to somebody like that?
First of all, I was really hoping you would come to that question, because to me this is one of the most critical things. When we look around the world and we see countries fighting for democracy, we say, go for it. You should fight hard. Get on the streets, protest, stand up for yourselves. So we should at least have the wherewithal to go out and vote and prove how much we believe in democracy. If that's what we're saying about other countries, then let's vote and show how much we value that right here.
And a reminder for those listening, before the end of the month, Election Day is April 28th. I want to thank you very much, Kathy. This has been a great conversation. I learned a lot, and it's giving me a lot to think about. And all the best to you going forward.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's really been a pleasure to have this opportunity to chat with you.
And good luck with the new book.
Well, thank you.
Our guest, Kathy Brock, Professor Emerita from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. If you'd like more information on books she has written, send her an email, kathy.brock@queensu.ca. This episode was recorded April 9th, 2025. To those who have taken the time to listen to this podcast, thank you, and I'll be back soon with another conversation.
The theme music for the podcast is Stace's Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the kingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.